Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to do a follow-up to a previous video I have on the channel. A couple of months back, I posted a video titled On the Schmidentity of the Gods. I'll link it up here, and in the video description if I'm smart enough. And in that video, I talked about the complicated nature of syncretism and polytheism, and the way that even if we conceive of deities as real, distinct entities with their own personalities and their own agency, there are some deities who have very similar natures, who historically, sort of their cults come from the same place, they share a common point of origin, and there are some deities who are very close to each other, who are very alike, in such a way that they can sometimes meaningfully be said to be the same, at least in some ritual contexts, such that, you know, if you invoke one in a ritual and you accidentally get the other coming through, you haven't necessarily done something wrong, you're sort of getting a different, you know, tributary to the same stream, sort of thing. And I called this weird identity-like relation schmidentity, because it's not exactly the same as identity, but it's something very similar. It's something very close to identity. And a couple of examples I gave were, I think, Odin and Wotan, Diana and Artemis, Ishtar and Inanna, right? These are deities who historically share a provenance in their worship, and who in their mythology, in their iconography, sometimes even in their names, are very, very similar to each other in such a way that the lines kind of get blurred between them. And, you know, you can be a pretty firm polytheist and still believe that there are cases in which two different cultures may have been worshipping the same god under different names or something like that. And so you want a way to express that sameness. In that video, I said, sort of as a throwaway comment at the end, that at some point I might return to the subject and talk about schmidentity specifically with regard to the Wiccan gods. So which deities from world mythology have this strange sameness relationship to the gods who are worshipped in traditional Wicca? So that's what we're going to do today. Before we dive into that, just a couple of important caveats. The first is that Wicca is an experiential religion. Different people have different theological perspectives. So the perspective I'm going to offer here today is my own perspective, but is by no means authoritative, is by no means the only one. There will be people who disagree with me, either because they think that there are names on my list that shouldn't be there, or because there are names that they think should be on the list that I have chosen to leave off. So this is really just sort of a starting point, a jumping off point to begin to explore the ways that the Wiccan gods are connected to figures from world mythology. And this is by no means the be-all and end-all. Secondly, for anyone who just sort of searched in YouTube Wicca gods and came across this video, it's important to note that I am a traditional Gardnerian Wiccan. I belong to the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca, and the particular strand of the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca that I was initiated into very much sees itself as the priesthood of two particular deities. So I am talking about those deities. In some other versions of Wicca, you'll find it's more common to venerate sort of a goddess and a god, and you choose to work with or worship a goddess or god who are more suited to you based on your profession or your personality or your magical interests or whatever. That's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm taking an approach to Wicca that has a specific set of two deities, where there's a lunar mother goddess and her consort, the horned god of hunting, agriculture, sex, death, and all the fun stuff. So with those two caveats out of the way, we're going to look at a couple of figures from world mythology who I think... Oh, you know what? There's going to be a third caveat. I lied. The third caveat is that we're going to be looking at figures from world mythology, but importantly, we're not just looking at mythology as it existed in the ancient world. We're also thinking about the way that contemporary figures sort of looked back on and reinterpreted some of that mythology. So there may be features that got attributed to particular deities in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries that were not as heavily emphasized in their ancient worship, but that became a very big part of how they were thought about later on. And that can affect the way we understand how those deities relate to the gods of Wicca. You'll see what I mean as we get into it. So, with all that off the table, let's dive in. Now, I want to start out with two big names, and the two big names I want to touch on first are Isis and Diana. Isis was one of the first sort of great syncretic goddesses. Well, that's a controversial claim. Isis was a great syncretic goddess in the ancient world. We have a record of the worship of Isis, which is sort of a little coded because it was written by a priest who was an initiate of the mystery cult of Isis, who obviously didn't want to give away the game. But The Golden Ass by Apuleius is a book that famously recounts the story, the fictional story, of a man who goes through a series of magical misadventures and ends up being saved by initiation into the mystery cult of Isis. And at the end of the book, he has a vision of Isis, really quite extraordinary, where she proclaims herself to be all and everything. So she says, "Look at me, Lucius." Sorry, I'm going to read out a little bit from the book. In this vision, Isis has appeared to Lucius, the main character of the story, and is telling him to worship her in order to be released from his curse. Earlier in the book, he was cursed and got turned into a donkey, and he spent most of the book trying to get out of that. She says, "Look at me, Lucius. By your prayers have I been moved, and here I am. I, the mother of the universe, the mistress of all the elements, the firstborn offspring of the world of time. I, the highest of the powers above, the queen of the shades below, the first of all who dwell in the heavens. I, the one true face and manifestation of all the gods and goddesses. At my nod I set in place the lights and heights of heaven, the salubrious sea breezes, the silences of the despairs of hell. My power unequaled, unchanging, is worshipped throughout the world, behind manifold images, through myriad rites, by uncountable names. Accordingly, the firstborn Phrygians call me this is where it gets tough, the Pessinuntian mother of the gods. Here, the aboriginal inhabitants of Attica call me the Cecropian Minerva. There, the wave-washed citizens of Cyprus call me the Venus of Paphos. The bow and arrow men of Crete call me Diana Dictina. The trilingual Sicilians call me the Proserpina of Ortygia. The ancient people of Eleusis call me the Ceres of Attica. Some call me Juno, some Bellona. Here they call me Hecate, there they call me Rhamnusia. But both races of Ethiopians, those on whom the sun god shines at his rising and those on whom he sets, and the Egyptians, those paragons of ancient lore and learning, who worship me in ceremonies that are truly my own, call me by my true name, Queen Isis." And then it keeps going on for quite a while. But so in The Golden Ass, we get this wild, beautiful, syncretic vision of Isis as an all-encompassing goddess. She's the queen of the heaven, but she's also sort of the embodiment of the earth and the sea, and every god or goddess you could possibly imagine is actually just Isis wearing a different mask. Really important is that Isis is described as this mother figure. She is the mother of Horus, she is the mother of the gods, and these are things that become really important to the early imagery of Wicca. Not all Wiccans take a syncretic view of the goddess, but certainly some of the early figures really did. And you can see them drawing on a lot of this sort of Isis-like imagery. The other thing about Isis is that she has a consort, as of course does the Wiccan goddess. And Isis's consort is Osiris, the Lord of Death and Resurrection, he who comes forth by day, etc., etc., etc. He has all kinds of epithets, but he is a god associated with agriculture and the grain. He is cut down by his jealous brother and then is resurrected, and his myth is associated with the seasonal harvest of the grain. He's the lord of the afterworld, he's the judge of the souls of the dead, and all of these things get folded into the imagery of the Wiccan god. There's actually a place, oh shoot, I didn't pull it off my shelf. In The Meaning of Witchcraft, in one of Gerald Gardner's books, which I have right up there on my shelf, Gardner actually explicitly says that the Wiccan gods can be understood as being quite similar to Isis and Osiris. The other interesting thing about Isis is that she becomes very, very important in late 19th and early 20th century occultism. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was really fascinated by Egyptian mythology and Egyptology, right? This is a period at the height of the British Empire, when British Egyptologists are pillaging Egypt for all of the artifacts that they can find, trying to unearth as much history as they can find in ancient Egypt. Well, they're not in ancient Egypt, but in Egypt. And a lot of this gets worked into concepts about occultism, magic, mythology. People were really, really fascinated with Egyptian magic. You see in Thelema, the goddess Nuit has a great deal in common with Isis and Hadit has a great deal in common with Osiris. And then their child Rahurhuit is aligned with Horus, and the Aeon of Horus is the Aeon of Rahurhuit. You also see that in the works of Dion Fortune. So Dion Fortune quite famously ran a series of goddess rituals called the Rites of Isis. She had complementary rituals for the divine masculine called the Rites of Pan. But the Rites of Isis really explicitly identified Isis as sort of this all-encompassing divine feminine principle. The goddess, as Dion Fortune conceived of her, was Isis. And Dion Fortune, particularly in her novel The Sea Priestess, also really emphasizes the connection of Isis to the moon, to the tides. These are things that did sort of exist in ancient Isis worship. Isis was sometimes linked up with the moon, but it got really much more heavily emphasized in the 20th century. So Isis is name number one on the table. And I think that Isis has a great deal in common with our goddess as a sovereign mother, as a sort of a queen of heaven and earth, as a goddess of magic and witchcraft, right? There's a story about how Isis gained power over, I think it was Ta. It was either Ta or Ra. I'm not so great with a lot of Egyptian mythology, and I apologize to those of you who really know your stuff here. But there's a story about how Isis learned the true name of, we're going to go with Ta. See, now I'm doubting myself. I think it might be Ra. Anyway, she learned the true name of the head bitch in charge, and in so doing, she gained magical power over him. So Isis is a very important figure, both in sort of the general construction of occultism and magic in the early through mid-20th centuries, but then also specifically in the formation of goddess worship and in the articulation of the Wiccan goddess. The second big name we have is Diana. Diana, perhaps most famous as the goddess of the witches from Charles Godfrey Leland's Aradia, the Gospel of the Witches. Diana is described as the mother of Aradia, this sort of messianic first witch figure. And Diana is the goddess that the witches come together to worship at their Sabbaths. Diana in the Gospel has a brother, Lucifer, who is the god of light. Diana is the goddess of the moon, darkness, and witchcraft. Lucifer is the god of light, and she seduces her brother in order to give birth to Aradia and send her down to liberate the oppressed people of Italy. Aside from the Gospel of the Witches, Diana also appears quite notably as a goddess of witchcraft in the Canon Episcopi, which was a piece of church law that said that witchcraft, probably not so real, but there are people who are deceived by Satan into thinking that they are witches, and when they believe that they are out consorting with Diana, the goddess of the witches. And so there's an early association of Diana with witchcraft in medieval church law, because there was this idea that witches were deluded by Satan into believing that they were worshiping the pagan goddess Diana. We also see Diana show up in narratives about witchcraft, in part due to the Canon Episcopi, in Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. In this book, Margaret Murray explicitly identifies Diana as the goddess of the witches, and when the witch god appears in a male form, Murray identifies it as Janus, or Janus, or Janus, or, whatever variation you want, but it's sort of a masculinized form of the name Diana. Later on in her book, The God of the Witches, Murray would sort of change her narrative a little bit, and she decided that the name of the masculine god of the witches was Cernunnos, after the Gaulish deity. But here in the witch cult in Western Europe, she really strongly identifies Diana and Dianos as the female and male versions of the god of the witches. And so Diana, historically very deeply associated with witchcraft, particularly sort of the way that witchcraft was thought about in more modern times, but also Romantic poetry, or sort of the Romantic period in literature, really strongly emphasized Diana as a goddess of nature, as sort of the archetypal goddess of the wilds and hunting, and this very like robust romanticized vision of nature in contrast with the rapidly urbanizing society that a lot of these poets inhabited. Ronald Hutton talks about this a great deal. In particular, he puts a lot of emphasis on Swinburne. Aside from Swinburne, you have John Keats, who I also didn't think to pull off my shelf. Is he here? Can I grab Keats? Ugh. Keats has this poem Endymion, which is about a sort of priestly shepherd king who is dedicated to the service of the god Pan, and who then comes into a romantic relationship with the goddess Diana. And, you know, there's a whole epic story about how he falls in love with the moon, and then at the end they are united and together. So Diana as a goddess of the moon, but also as a goddess of nature and the wild, really gains prominence with the rise of Romantic poetry. And when she does gain prominence in that way, she is contrasted pretty heavily with Pan as the male god of the wilds, and this sort of pastoral shepherd figure. Pan, of course, being a horned god, has particular relevance to Wicca and the horned god of the witches. And once again, we see Pan as the archetypal divine masculine in a lot of Dion Fortune's work, where Isis was the goddess and Pan was the god. So these are figures, these are sort of divine pairings that become very important for Wicca. We're at 17 minutes already. We'll go a little bit longer. There are a couple of other names that I want to call out here, and these are names from Middle Eastern cults of a great mother goddess and her consort, the dying god. Importantly, this idea of sort of a pan-Middle Eastern cult of the mother goddess and the dying god is more of a modern invention. There was a little bit of that going on in the ancient world, but it's really sort of a modern idea that has been projected backward onto ancient paganism. And in particular, it comes from my favorite book, The Golden Bough. I have a previous video about the importance of the Golden Bough for Wicca. I'll link it up here. But the Golden Bough is really a defining moment for modern paganism because it looks back at a lot of ancient paganism, and it creates a grand unifying narrative about the way that ancient paganism might have been. That narrative is not terribly historically accurate. There are a lot of problems with Frazer methodologically, but that narrative becomes very important for the way that people in the 20th century think about paganism as they're trying to construct a pagan revival. And so the mother goddess and her consort, the dying god, or the god of death, become really key figures in Wicca in particular. And it's strongly due to the influence of this book. And Frazer names a few sort of pairs of deities as really crucial to this myth. So, he says, nowhere, apparently, have these rites been more widely and solemnly celebrated than in the lands which border the eastern Mediterranean. Under the names of Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis, and Attis, the peoples of Egypt and Western Asia represented a yearly decay and revival of life, especially of vegetable life, which they personified as a god who annually died and rose again from the dead. In name and detail, the rites varied from place to place. In substance, they were the same. So first off, we have with Frazer the idea that actually all of these cultures across the Mediterranean were doing the same thing. Historically, that's more of a complicated picture, but certainly in the modern age, there was a real tendency to view things in that way, and it's due in large part to Frazer's work. But these four names he gives for the god, I think, are really crucial. We've already seen Osiris, right? Osiris is the complement to Iris. But he gives three other names, which are Tammuz, Adonis, and Attis. And these are consorts, respectively, to Ishtar, Aphrodite, and Qabalah. Qabalah was the mother of the gods, a really interesting mythology from Phrygia, what is modern-day Turkey. Aphrodite had a really wide-ranging worship, and she was worshipped in different ways in different parts of the Mediterranean, but here we're thinking really particularly about the cult of Aphrodite at Paphos and Byblos, where the myth of Aphrodite and Adonis was central to her worship. And then Ishtar and Tammuz, also sort of schmidentical to Inanna and Dumuzi. If you haven't read this book, Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, by Dion Wolkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer, it is a really just beautiful poetic translation of all of the surviving textual fragments, hymns and stories about Inanna. I really recommend it. But those pairings of deities, to my mind, are really essential to the modern myth of the Wiccan gods, the mother goddess and her dying and resurrecting consort. Interestingly enough, right, the Golden Bough also talks in great detail about Diana and Isis. Frazer has a thing elsewhere in the book where he says that Isis was sort of the most sophisticated version of all these other mother goddesses. So Qabalah, Aphrodite, Isis, who is the one that I'm missing? Ishtar. These are all sort of variations on the same theme, but he thinks that Isis is the one that does it best. And then he talks in great detail about Diana, and specifically the cult of Diana at Aricia, which is a sanctuary south of Rome, where Diana had a priesthood set up, and there was a whole complicated thing. And that's the origin of this book is Frazer claims to be trying to understand the worship of Diana at Aricia. So there's a lot going on there. I'm talking fast, I realize that, but I don't want this to be an hour-long video. Those are the names that, for me, are the most essential to understanding the Wiccan gods. These are the gods that, to my mind, are the most schmidentical to the gods of Wicca. You'll notice that there are some names that I have left off the list. That's just me. That's just my take, right? So my experience of our gods tends to be very heavily focused on these Middle Eastern cults of a mother goddess and a dying and resurrecting god. Some of these goddesses, like to call Aphrodite a mother goddess, is weird and depends a lot on some of the historical revisionism of figures like James Frazer. Same thing with Diana, right? Diana was famously a virgin goddess. There are parts of the world, there are certain sanctuaries where that was not considered the case, particularly at Aricia, which is, once again, the focus of the Golden Bough. Diana had a consort, his name was Wirbius. So there are variations here, and certainly I'm thinking more about these figures as mother goddesses in the sense of modern reinterpretations of them than in the sense of how they were really historically actually worshipped. There are other people, just to throw out a couple of names you'll very popularly see associated with the Wiccan gods. I personally don't feel these connections, but there are people who find a lot of depth and meaning in connecting these types of figures to the Wiccan gods. You have Hecate, who is a goddess associated with the moon and with witchcraft. You'll see a lot of people associate Gaia as sort of Mother Earth, the Earth, with the Wiccan goddess. Doesn't do much for me, but there are certainly people who feel that connection. There are also people who will go further afield and talk about Shiva and Shakti as a divine pairing that might have some influence on Wicca, and certainly a version of Tantra, a version of Shaktism, was a strong influence on early 20th century occultism, and some of that worked its way into the way that early Wiccans were thinking about the gods. But that's just not how I connect to the gods, so I would not be the person to talk about that. We're reaching 25 minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to me ramble. And I would really love to hear, if you want to sort of share in the comments down below, what are some deities who you would consider schmidentical to the Wiccan gods? If you invoked the goddess and some other deity, some specific deity from world mythology came through instead, who are the deities who you would consider like, oh yeah, that's okay? Like, this deity is close enough to our goddess that I haven't screwed up by invoking the goddess and having this deity come through. So, I'll leave you off there. Thanks for watching, and bye.